The music was warm, the lights were bright, and everyone in the room believed they were witnessing a perfect celebration. But beneath the glittering surface, something darker was quietly taking shape. In that crowd of polished smiles and careful voices, a woman stood on the edge of a moment that would shatter her trust, her safety, and everything she thought she understood about love, power, and belonging. What happened next would turn joy into humiliation and expose a truth no one was prepared to face. Just when it seemed the humiliation was complete and the night could not cut any deeper, a hidden truth emerged from the shadows, and it changed everything. Don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe now and stay with us as this powerful story unfolds. The days leading up to the holiday gathering moved quietly, almost deceptively calm, as if life itself was trying to convince her that everything was fine. She went through her routines the way she always had, waking early, organizing her day, moving through the world with a kind of practiced strength that had carried her through so many silent battles before. From the outside, nothing looked unusual. Her smile remained gentle, her presence composed, her voice steady. But inside, there was a quiet unease she could not fully name, a faint tension that lingered beneath every thought, like a shadow that refused to disappear no matter how bright the light became. She had learned long ago how to exist in spaces where she felt watched, measured, and misunderstood. She had learned how to breathe through moments where comments came wrapped in politeness, but carried the heavy weight of prejudice beneath them. She had learned to stand tall, to remain composed, to protect her dignity in a world that too often tried to strip it away without ever admitting it was doing so. And yet, none of that preparation could erase the feeling that something in her life was beginning to shift, slowly, silently, just beyond her understanding. Her husband, on the other hand, seemed more energized than ever. Every conversation he had that week circled back to the upcoming party, the people who would be there, the influence they carried, the doors he believed they could open for him. To him, the evening was not just a social gathering. It was a performance, a stage, a carefully curated opportunity to reinforce an image he valued more than the reality of the person standing beside him. He spoke about it with excitement, but beneath that excitement lived something colder, something sharper, something that cared more about perception than partnership. She watched him move through their home with restless ambition, his thoughts consumed by appearance, status, and reputation. He rehearsed the expressions he would wear, the stories he would tell, the posture he would hold. But there was a growing distance in the way he looked at her, a distance that said she was expected to fit into the picture he wanted to present, rather than exist freely as herself. There were moments when his silence felt louder than his words, moments when attention turned away from her needs and fixed itself entirely on how the world would see him. Still, she prepared for the evening with quiet care, not for the sake of the room, not for the sake of approval, but for herself, because dignity to her was not a costume she wore for others, but a truth she carried within her. She chose her attire thoughtfully, not to impress, but to honor the strength she had built through years of perseverance in a world that did not always welcome her presence. She breathed deeply before stepping out the door, reminding herself that she belonged anywhere her feet touched the ground, no matter how long people hesitated to recognize it. When they arrived at the venue, the night sparkled with polished elegance. Laughter drifted through the air, music flowed softly in the background, and every corner of the room seemed designed to project wealth, success, and control. People greeted one another with smiles that didn't always reach their eyes, exchanging compliments that sometimes felt more like evaluations than genuine warmth. She sensed it immediately, the silent questions, the lingering glances, the careful curiosity that followed her just a little longer than everyone else. It was subtle, familiar, and exhausting, yet she remained poised. She moved with grace, offering kindness where it was not always returned, allowing her presence to speak for itself even when others tried to reduce it to a silent accessory beside her husband. She noticed the moments when her voice was ignored, when her identity was acknowledged only in passing, when her existence seemed to be observed rather than embraced. The room was filled with people who considered themselves refined, progressive, and fair. Yet beneath the surface, quiet prejudice lived comfortably in the spaces they refused to examine. And still, she endured. As the night progressed, her husband drifted further away from her emotionally, even as he stood inches from her side. The more attention he received, the more detached he became. He basked in validation from people whose approval he had chased for years, people whose acceptance he valued more than respect within his own home. His pride swelled, his ego sharpened, and somewhere along that path, The bond between them began to fracture in ways that could no longer be hidden behind smiles or small talk. She felt the fracture, even if the room did not. The conversations grew louder, the laughter more careless, and somewhere in the shifting atmosphere, an undercurrent of tension began to form, subtle but unmistakable. She could sense it before she understood it. A slow tightening in the air, a lingering heaviness beneath the music, a quiet feeling that something was building toward a moment she was not prepared for. Her instincts grew alert, her breath slowed, and every step she took felt like it carried her closer to something she could not yet see. There had already been signs, decisions made without her, choices that diminished her role, comments that made her feel small while disguised as casual remarks. There had been moments when respect vanished behind ambition, when love dissolved into control, when affection transformed into performance. She had swallowed those moments, hoping the cracks would heal, hoping patience would repair what pride had begun to damage. But that night, the cracks no longer hid themselves. They widened, and the truth they revealed was heavier than anything she had ever expected to face. As she stood in that grand room filled with shimmering decorations and carefully staged success, she carried herself with the same steady strength she always had. And yet, something within her trembled. Not from fear, but from the quiet recognition that the future of her life was approaching a turning point she had never asked for, never imagined, and would never forget. And behind all of it, behind the elegance, the confidence, the illusion of control, an unseen truth waited patiently in the background, one that would reshape everything before the night was over. A truth no one in that room was prepared to face, least of all the man who believed he held all the power in his hands. As the evening stretched deeper into the night, the atmosphere inside the grand hall began to change in ways that only those who were paying attention could truly feel. The laughter grew sharper, the glances more pointed, and the undercurrent of judgment that had lingered quietly beneath the surface now pulsed more openly through the room. She moved through that space with calm restraint, but inside, a quiet storm had begun to stir, one shaped by unease, awareness, and the heavy realization that something was slowly closing in around her. She could sense it not through words, but through the way people shifted when she walked near, through the subtle change in expression when her presence entered a conversation, through the way admiration toward her husband never quite extended far enough to acknowledge her as his equal. It was as if the room had crafted an invisible boundary around her, one that allowed her to stand inside it, but never truly belong within it. She had lived through these moments before, in different places, in different rooms, carried by a history that stretched far beyond her own experiences. But tonight, the weight of those unspoken divisions pressed down on her with a force she could no longer ignore. Her husband remained absorbed in the glow of attention and validation, drifting further into conversations that fed his pride and distanced him from the reality of the person standing silently beside him. With every interaction, he seemed to transform, not into someone new, but into the truest version of who he had been becoming for years. Someone who valued status over respect, image over humanity, ambition over love. The space between them widened, not physically, but emotionally, a widening so sharp that she felt it like a cold wind cutting through her chest. Moments began to stack upon one another, small, subtle, but unmistakable. A gesture meant to dismiss rather than include. A glance that reduced her presence to an accessory rather than a partner. A quiet expectation that she remain poised, silent, compliant, unchallenging. Each moment carried its own sting, but together they formed something larger, a pattern that exposed a truth she had tried, for too long, to explain away. Deep inside, the realization settled in like a slow ache. She was standing next to a man who did not see her, not truly, not fully, not with the respect and dignity she deserved. Yet the night continued, as if unaware of the storm building beneath its glittering surface. The music flowed, the conversations swirled, and somewhere between the movements of people and the shifting glow of the chandelier lights, the tension around her sharpened into something undeniable, something that warned her the night was moving toward a moment that would alter everything. She could feel the energy of the room tighten, as if the air itself was bracing for a moment none of them were ready to acknowledge. Her breath deepened, her heartbeat steadied, and instinct told her that whatever was coming would change the course of the night, and perhaps the course of her life. Then the center of attention shifted. Slowly, subtly, eyes began to gather in one direction. The crowd's focus narrowed, curiosity rising like a wave slowly lifting itself toward the shore. Conversations softened, movement slowed, Anticipation filled the space with a quiet electricity that hummed against the back of her thoughts. She felt it before she understood it, the sensation of being drawn into a moment she had not chosen, a moment that was not meant to honor her, but to place her on display. And she stood there, suspended in that fragile instant between calm and collapse. What unfolded next did not come as a loud explosion. It emerged as a carefully staged act of control, wrapped in the appearance of confidence, cloaked in the illusion of composure. The crowd watched with a mix of curiosity and restraint, too uncertain to intervene, too intrigued to turn away. It was in that silence, that deep, echoing silence, that the real violence of the moment existed, not in physical harm, not in raised voices, but in public degradation, in humiliation disguised as formality, in the cruel, calculated stripping of dignity in a space where she was already forced to fight for belonging. The realization struck her slowly, painfully, like a wave rising before it breaks. The room, once filled with warmth and celebration, had transformed into a stage where power was no longer subtle, where prejudice no longer hid behind polite conversation, where the fragile boundary between respect and control shattered in an instant. She felt exposed beneath the gaze of strangers who did not know her story, did not understand her strength, did not see the years of resilience that had carried her to this moment. To them, it was spectacle. To her, it was a wound. Inside, emotion surged like a storm finally reaching shore. Shame burned through her chest. Anger pulsed beneath her skin. Heartbreak wrapped itself around her ribs until every breath felt sharp and unsteady. But beneath all that pain lived something deeper, something ancient, something powerful, something shaped by generations of strength in the face of injustice. It was the part of her that refused to break, even when humiliation tried to fracture every piece of who she was. It was the strength that came not from pride, but from truth. And still, the room remained silent, not a silence of confusion, but a silence of complicity. The kind of silence that allows cruelty to exist comfortably, that protects the powerful, that punishes the vulnerable for daring to exist beyond the limits others have tried to place upon them. In that silence, she understood something painful and undeniable. She was not only facing betrayal from the person standing closest to her, she was standing inside a system of perception and prejudice that had always been prepared to let moments like this happen. And for a brief, devastating second, she felt utterly alone. Yet even in that isolation, something inside her refused to disappear. Her spirit did not crumble. Her identity did not dissolve. Her dignity, though shaken, though wounded, remained rooted within her, deeper than the attempts to strip it away. She had survived too much, endured too much, risen above too much to let this moment erase the truth of who she was. But the night was not finished, because beneath the pain, beneath the humiliation, beneath the echoing silence of a room that chose to watch rather than act, another truth waited patiently in the shadows, one that neither the crowd nor the man who stood so confidently before them fully understood. A truth tied not to shame but to consequence, not to humiliation but to justice, not to his power but to the power that had always existed beyond his control. A truth that would not simply expose him, but redefine everything he believed he commanded. And as the tension thickened around her like an unbroken storm cloud lingering in the sky, the night hung in a fragile balance, poised between destruction and revelation, cruelty and consequence, heartbreak and the beginning of something far greater than anyone in that room could yet comprehend. What came next would not erase the pain of what she endured, but it would begin to reveal just how deeply he had underestimated the very life he thought he controlled, and the strength of the woman he believed he could break. The night seemed to freeze in place, suspended in a fragile stillness that felt heavier than sound itself, as if every hidden truth, every unspoken tension, every buried intention had risen silently to the surface. The room remained bright and polished on the outside, but beneath the glow of the chandeliers, the atmosphere shifted into something sharper, something colder, something that pulsed with the weight of consequence. She stood there, still and composed, though inside her chest a storm of emotions surged and collided. Pain, anger, disbelief, heartbreak, and a slow-forming clarity that felt both devastating and undeniable. Everything she had endured, everything she had overlooked, every compromise she had made for the sake of peace and dignity now converged into one shattering moment that could no longer be ignored or softened or explained away. The humiliation lingered in the air like a stain that refused to fade, pressing against her skin, echoing through her thoughts, sinking into the deepest corners of memory where pain becomes something impossible to forget. She She could feel the eyes on her, not kind eyes, not compassionate eyes, but eyes that evaluated, analyzed, judged, and measured her through a lens she never chose to stand beneath. Some held curiosity, some discomfort, some quiet satisfaction, and others attempted to mask their unease behind a fragile facade of restraint. Yet none of them stepped forward. None of them broke the silence. None of them challenged the cruelty unfolding in front of them. And in that stillness, she saw a truth larger than the moment itself, a truth that stretched beyond the room, beyond the night, beyond her own experience. This was not only about betrayal. This was about the way power is used to control, the way prejudice hides behind pride, the way dignity is stolen not always through violence, but through public humiliation wrapped in politeness and authority. It was about every unspoken rule that told people like her to endure, to stay calm, to remain composed no matter how deeply the injustice cut beneath the surface. The realization ached through her heart like a raw wound, but it also awakened something fierce inside her, not rage, not bitterness, but strength. A strength that rose not from anger but from truth. The man who believed he had orchestrated the moment stood anchored in false confidence, unaware of the quiet shift taking place around him, unaware that the illusion he had built was beginning to fracture in ways he could no longer control. He had lived his life chasing approval, constructing an image polished enough to impress those who valued appearances more than character. And he had convinced himself that success meant dominance, that authority meant superiority, that respect could be demanded rather than earned. But beneath the performance, beneath the ego, beneath the illusion of control, his world rested on foundations he did not truly understand. Foundations intertwined with lives, with relationships, with people whose strength did not come from pride but from integrity. And now those foundations began to tremble. The truth that had remained hidden, the truth that existed silently in the background of his life, the truth he had never cared enough to acknowledge, now moved forward like a quiet tide rising against a fragile shore. It did not arrive with noise or spectacle. It did not burst into the moment with chaos or aggression. Instead, it revealed itself slowly, steadily, powerfully, the way reality always does when it cannot be ignored any longer. And as that truth emerged, something shifted in the posture of the room, in the stillness of the air, in the way people began to realize that the narrative he thought he controlled did not belong to him at all. The consequences did not strike in anger. They unfolded through exposure. Because the life he had built, the career he guarded, the opportunities he celebrated as his own achievements were never creations of his pride alone. They were supported by a hand he refused to acknowledge, by a family he considered secondary to his ambition, by a foundation rooted not in arrogance, but in legacy, responsibility, and quiet influence. The very success he wielded as a weapon of control had been sustained by the same people he dismissed, disregarded, and disrespected when it no longer served his image. And when that quiet support withdrew, when the presence that had silently protected his path stepped out of the shadows, the strength he believed belonged to him alone dissolved before his eyes. The shift was subtle at first, a change in the expressions around him, a ripple of awareness moving slowly through the room, a recognition spreading silently across the faces of those who once looked at him with admiration. It was not loud or dramatic, it was far more devastating than that. Respect did not break loudly, it faded, it drained. It slipped away piece by piece until nothing of it remained but the echo of what used to be. He stood in the center of that space believing he had won control, not realizing he had revealed the very flaws that would undo everything he cherished. While she, wounded yet unbroken, stood anchored in a rising truth that could no longer be silenced. For her, the moment unfolded differently. She did not feel triumph. She did not feel victory. What filled her instead was something deeper, something steadier. A sense of truth settling into place, a recognition that strength does not rise through revenge or retaliation, but through the quiet reclaiming of dignity that injustice tried to erase. She did not need to strike back. She did not need to match his cruelty. Her power did not come from his downfall, it came from refusing to let humiliation define her, from standing even when the world tried to force her to crumble, from knowing that who she was, and who she had always been, could not be rewritten by someone else's pride. The night no longer belonged to the illusion he had created, it belonged to truth. A truth that revealed the fragility of power built on ego. A truth that exposed how quickly false superiority dissolves when confronted with integrity. A truth that reminded everyone in the room that dignity cannot be taken by those who never understood it. It can only be surrendered, and she refused to surrender hers. The moment was painful, yes, deeply, profoundly painful, but within that pain lived awakening, and within that awakening lived transformation. The people who once viewed her as an accessory could no longer deny her presence. Those who ignored her strength could no longer pretend it wasn't there. The silence that once protected cruelty now reflected back at them like a mirror they could no longer avoid. Some confronted discomfort within themselves. Some saw, for the first time, the harm in their quiet complicity. Others turned away, not out of indifference, but out of fear. Fear of acknowledging the truth that lived not only in this moment, but in countless others like it across the world. And through it all, she stood, not untouched, not unhurt, but unbroken, carrying the weight of the moment while refusing to let it rewrite the worth that lived within her. Her heart carried scars, yes, but scars that spoke of survival, of endurance, of identity that remained intact even when the world tried to fracture it. The humiliation did not define her story. The injustice did not determine her worth. The cruelty did not erase the strength she had built across years of perseverance in spaces not designed to welcome her. Her life would not end at this moment of pain. It would evolve beyond it. The night grew quieter as the illusion of control unraveled, and somewhere in that silence, a powerful truth settled over the room. A truth about racism that does not always scream in anger or reveal itself through obvious hatred, but instead lives in expectations, in control, in humiliation disguised as authority. A truth about how easily people remain silent when injustice unfolds in front of them. A truth about how often dignity is tested by those who believe their status entitles them to diminish someone else. But it was also a truth about resilience, about the strength of those who continue to rise despite being underestimated, about the unbreakable spirit of people who are expected to endure quietly yet choose, instead to stand firmly in their identity. It was a truth about how injustice may wound, but it cannot erase courage. The night would leave scars, but it would also leave a lesson. Not only for her, but for everyone who witnessed, everyone who participated through silence, everyone who believed that power existed only in appearance and authority. Because what remained after the illusion collapsed was not his pride, not his ambition, not his image, but the undeniable reality that strength does not belong to those who humiliate others. Strength belongs to those who survive it, carry it, and rise beyond it. And as the night reached its breaking point, as truth replaced illusion and consequence replaced ego, the story did not disappear into darkness. It stood at the edge of transformation, waiting for what would come next, waiting for the moment when pain would become purpose, when humiliation would become awareness, when endurance would become power. For this was not the end. This was the turning of a page in a story far larger than the room that tried to contain it. And the world beyond that room was waiting to feel its impact. In the weeks that followed, the memory of that night did not disappear. It lived quietly inside her, not as a wound that refused to close, but as a moment that reshaped the way she saw herself, the world around her, and the silent weight of injustice she had carried for so long. The noise of the evening faded, the lights dimmed, the conversations ended, but the impact remained, etched beneath the surface like a mark time could not erase. She woke each morning with the same breath in her chest, the same strength in her spirit. Yet she was no longer the woman who had walked into that room believing patience would protect her from harm. She had stepped through humiliation and emerged with a deeper understanding of her worth, one that no gaze, no voice, no act of cruelty could ever take away again, no matter how deeply the world once tried to diminish it. The illusion he had lived behind did not survive the aftermath. The world he once navigated with confidence changed almost overnight, not because people suddenly gained compassion, but because truth had finally removed the mask he had hidden behind for so long. The respect he once believed he owned became distant. The admiration he depended on began to crumble, and the very relationships he had valued more than loyalty and dignity drifted away in silence. The more his image unraveled, the more he was forced to confront the reality he had spent years avoiding. That success built on control, ego, and quiet prejudice is fragile, and power that depends on diminishing others will always collapse beneath its own weight. As doors began to close around him, he could not outrun consequence. The support he once took for granted, the stability he assumed would always protect him, no longer stood at his side. The foundation beneath his life did not collapse out of anger or spite. It shifted because truth demanded accountability. And in that shift, he discovered something he had never acknowledged before. The strength he believed belonged to him had never been his alone, and the power he tried to wield over others had blinded him to his own dependence on those he treated without care. A realization as relentless as the silence that followed his fall. For her, the path forward was not simple, but it was honest. Healing did not arrive as a sudden wave of relief. It moved slowly, gently, like sunlight filtering through a heavy sky after a long storm. There were days when the memory of that night returned with sharp clarity, when the echo of humiliation pressed softly against her chest, reminding her of the moment the world tried to reduce her to something small. But with every step, she learned that healing was not about erasing the past. It was about reclaiming the space within herself that pain had once occupied. It was about breathing with intention, walking with dignity, and choosing to define her story not by what was done to her, but by the strength she carried in surviving it. She surrounded herself with people who saw her fully, people who valued her voice, her presence, her depth, and her humanity. She created spaces where her identity was not questioned, where her worth was not conditional, where her existence did not have to prove itself valid. Slowly, her spirit began to rise again, not fragile, not uncertain, but grounded in truth, anchored in resilience, and illuminated by the quiet power of a life reclaimed from the shadow of injustice. And yet, even as healing slowly began its quiet work within her, the memory of that night did not disappear. It lived like a shadow that no longer controlled her but still walked beside her, reminding her of the line that had been crossed, the dignity that had been tested, and the resilience that refused to break. There were moments when the echo of that humiliation rose uninvited, when scenes replayed in the back of her mind. The silence of the room, the weight of the eyes upon her, the way power had been used not to uplift, but to diminish. But each time those memories surfaced, something within her responded with strength instead of shame. She no longer saw herself as the wounded figure standing beneath judgment. She saw herself as the woman who endured, who stood firm when the world expected collapse, who protected the truth of who she was even when others tried to define her through prejudice and control. And while the pain remained real, so too did the transformation, reshaping the way she carried herself through the world. The lesson she took from that night was not one of defeat, but of awakening, an awakening to the quiet ways injustice hides beneath elegance, to the subtle ways dignity is tested, to the strength that rises only when someone is pushed to the edge of their silence. The people who had once pretended not to see now found themselves confronted by what they had allowed to unfold. And though many still chose comfort over courage, some began to question their own stillness, their own role in the silence that protected cruelty. For the man who had once stood at the center of the room believing he held all the control, the truth settled in with a weight heavier than humiliation. A realization that what he lost that night was not only admiration, opportunity, or image, but the illusion that power could be built on the suffering of another. And in that unmasking, the world around them shifted, quietly, irreversibly, as identity, consequence, and truth collided in a way that neither of them would ever be able to forget. In the months that followed, she began to rebuild her life not from what had been broken, but from what had survived, from the strength that had carried her through years of unspoken battles, from the dignity that endured even when the world tried to take it from her, from the resilience that rose each time she was forced to walk through spaces that were never made to hold her with respect. Healing moved through her days slowly, like light returning after a long, unsettled storm, not erasing what happened, but softening its sting, turning pain into memory and memory into understanding. There were mornings when she stood in the mirror and saw not the woman who had once been placed on display, but the woman who refused to disappear, who refused to fold beneath judgment, who chose to stand rooted in her truth even when the world gave her every reason to fall. She began surrounding herself with voices that honored her presence rather than tolerated it, with people who valued her humanity instead of measuring her against expectations she never agreed to carry. In those spaces, she found breath again. She found calm. She found a sense of belonging not built on performance, but on authenticity, on recognition, on mutual respect. And slowly, the heaviness in her chest transformed into clarity, a clarity that allowed her to see that worth does not come from acceptance, from approval, or from proximity to power, but from the life within, from the courage to continue, from the choice to rise even when the world becomes a storm. Her resilience did not appear loud or dramatic. It was steady, grounded, unwavering, the kind of strength that grows quietly and remains long after cruelty has faded into distant memory. And through that quiet strength, she discovered that survival was never the end of her story. It was the beginning of a life lived with deeper purpose, deeper awareness, and a deeper understanding of who she truly was. Meanwhile, the consequence that had once moved like an unseen current around him settled into his life with undeniable permanence. The admiration he once depended on no longer returned to him with the same warmth. The rooms that once opened their doors with expectation now received him with hesitation, with guarded expressions, with a quiet distance reserved for those whose character had been revealed. The foundation of influence he believed he had built began to show the cracks that had always existed beneath its polished surface. Cracks formed from pride, from entitlement, from the inability to see the humanity of the woman who once stood beside him. Opportunities faded, not because the world wished him harm, but because truth carries weight, and weight eventually reshapes what it touches. The people who once praised his composure now questioned what hid beneath it. The conversations that once celebrated his ambition now lingered with unspoken doubt. And through that slow unraveling, he was forced to confront the painful reality that success built on diminishing others cannot sustain itself, that power rooted in disrespect will always collapse under the pressure of truth. In that distance, in that silence, in that loss of certainty, he came face to face with his own reflection, stripped of polish, stripped of performance, left to recognize that the woman he tried to control had always possessed a strength he could never command, because it did not belong to status or approval or perception. It belonged to integrity, and integrity was something he had never learned to value until it was too late. For her, the understanding that emerged from those months was not defined by bitterness or vengeance, but by clarity, a clarity that allowed her to move forward without carrying the weight of what others had done to her, without allowing injustice to harden her spirit or dim the compassion that had always guided her life. She did not seek to prove anything to the world or to reclaim worth the world once tried to question. Instead, she chose to live fully, intentionally, grounded in the knowledge that her dignity had never depended on anyone else's permission to exist. She walked through familiar spaces now with a different kind of presence, not quieter, not smaller, but calmer, steadier, infused with a strength that did not need to announce itself to be felt. And in that quiet strength, the balance of power shifted, not outwardly, not through confrontation or display, but inwardly through the unbreakable certainty of knowing who she was, of knowing what she deserved, of knowing that no moment of cruelty could erase the truth of her identity. The world around her still carried traces of the same injustices she once faced, but where she once endured silently, she now moved with awareness, with conviction, with the willingness to name what others tried to disguise beneath elegance and civility. Her voice did not rise in anger. It rose in truth, in presence, in the simple but powerful refusal to shrink. And in that refusal, she discovered that real power does not come from dominating others. It comes from refusing to let injustice define the boundaries of one's life, from choosing to stand with calm resilience even when the world attempts to diminish what it does not understand. In time, her story did not fade into memory. It traveled quietly beyond her own life, becoming a mirror for others who had walked through similar rooms, who had carried similar wounds, who had endured similar silences. It became a reminder that racism does not always appear in loud confrontations or obvious cruelty. Sometimes it lives in the expectations placed upon those who must constantly prove their worth, in the spaces where dignity is tested through subtle exclusion and public humiliation disguised as decorum. It became a testament to the strength of those who refuse to disappear, who refuse to surrender their identity for acceptance, who continue to rise even when the world tells them they should remain small. And as her life moved forward, she carried one truth that no moment of injustice could erase, that her worth was never defined by another person's prejudice, never determined by a room that failed to see her, never diminished by the silence of those who chose comfort over conscience. Her worth was rooted in resilience, in humanity, in the courage to continue. The night that was meant to break her instead revealed who she truly was, and perhaps, for those who heard her story, it revealed something else as well. A question that lingers long after the final words fall silent. A question that demands reflection rather than comfort. A question that refuses to disappear. How many stories like hers continue to unfold in silence, and how long will the world allow them to continue before choosing to stand, to speak, and to finally change what should never have been accepted at all?